Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. Lukas had always been different from his brothers. Where Tade and Bale lived recklessly, moving from one indulgence to another, Lukas was the kind of young man who could spend an entire day in his father's office, poring over documents and asking questions about the business. Chief Atakanal often said that Lukas reminded him of himself in his younger days, sharp, hard-working, and disciplined. Unlike his elder brothers, who saw their father's wealth as an endless stream of luxury, Lukas viewed it as something to protect and build upon. This difference was not lost on Tade and Bale. They noticed the way their father spoke about Lukas, the way he allowed him to sit in on meetings that they were never invited to. They noticed how, even in casual conversation, Chief Atakanal would always praise Lukas's ambition while barely acknowledging them. At first, it was easy to ignore, but as the years passed, resentment began to fester. It started as a whisper in their minds, a quiet frustration that could be brushed aside. But the more they watched, the more they felt the gap widening, and the more they started to believe that their father had already chosen his successor. The tipping point came on an evening that should have been like any other. Tade and Bale had returned from a night out, their clothes reeking of alcohol, and their wallets significantly lighter than when they had left. As they stumbled past their father's study, voices from inside made them pause. They rarely paid attention to Chief Atakanal's meetings, but this time, one name caught their attention: Lukas. Pressing themselves against the door, they listened as their father spoke to an old friend, discussing his plans for the company's future. "Lukas is the only one who understands responsibility," their father was saying. "I have no choice. I have to ensure the business is left in capable hands." The words struck like a blade. It was no longer just a suspicion, it was a decision. Their father had already made up his mind. Lukas would inherit everything, and they, the rightful firstborn sons, would be left with whatever scraps he chose to give them. As they staggered back to their rooms, anger burned in their chests. This was not just favoritism, this was betrayal. For the first time, a dangerous thought entered their minds. If Lukas were no longer in the picture, everything would return to the way it was. Their father would have no choice but to depend on them. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous, something that would fade with the morning sun. But as days passed, the thought refused to leave them. Instead, it grew stronger, feeding on every memory of their father's coldness. Every moment Lukas was given special treatment. It was not fair. They were the firstborns. They had been there long before Lukas was even conceived. And yet, he was the one their father was willing to hand everything to? No, they would not allow it. They would find a way to stop him, to take back what should have been theirs from the beginning, even if it meant doing the unthinkable. For days, Tade and Bale carried the weight of their father's words like a curse they could not shake off. Every interaction with Chief Atakanal felt different now. Every glance he threw their way laced with unspoken judgment. Even Lukas, oblivious to the storm brewing in their hearts, became unbearable to watch. He moved through the house with an air of confidence, secure in his father's love and trust. He had no idea that his mere presence was a reminder of everything they had lost. The resentment that had once been a slow burn now raged like wildfire, consuming their thoughts and turning even the most mundane conversations into sparks of conflict. They argued with each other more often, not because they disagreed, but because the anger inside them needed an outlet. At night, Tade found himself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling as possibilities unfolded in his mind. It was Beo who finally voiced what they had both been thinking, his voice low and cautious. "What if we didn't have to lose?" he murmured. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken, before Tade finally turned to him, eyes dark with understanding. The plan came together piece by piece, an unholy puzzle that neither of them dared to acknowledge for what it truly was. They started by studying their father's habits, noting the times he was alone and the routines he followed. Chief Adekunle was a man of predictability, which worked in their favor. He always took his evening tea in his study, a sacred ritual he never strayed from. It would be easy to tamper with his drink, too easy, but they could not afford to be reckless. The evidence had to point in one direction and one direction only: Lukas. Over the next few weeks, they moved with caution, carefully planting small details that would later be used against him. A few staged arguments here and there, remarks made in passing about Lukas feeling unappreciated or pressured. They even took to moving some of his personal belongings closer to their father's study, making sure that, when the time came, there would be enough to raise suspicion. With each step, the weight in their chests lessened, replaced by a cold sense of determination. They weren't just doing this for themselves anymore. They were taking back what was rightfully theirs. The night of the crime arrived like an inevitability neither of them could escape. Tade was the one to prepare the tea, his hands steady as he stirred the poison into the steaming cup. Bayo stood by the door, listening for any interruptions, his breath coming in shallow bursts. When Chief Adekunle finally took his seat and lifted the cup to his lips, neither brother could move. The seconds stretched into eternity as he drank, pausing only to glance at a document in front of him. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in Teddy's mind, but it was too late. The father coughed once, then again, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something more alarming. The teacup slipped from his grasp, shattering against the wooden floor as his body convulsed. By the time his struggle ceased, the study was silent, save for the erratic breaths of his murderers. Bayo was the first to move, shaking himself free from the trance. "We have to go," he whispered, already stepping over the broken porcelain. But Tade lingered, staring down at their father's lifeless form. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the realization that there was no turning back. Without another word, they left the room, their footsteps disappearing into the night. The news of Chief Adekunle's death spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the community. Neighbors and business associates poured into the family home, their voices hushed with grief and speculation. The once lively mansion became a place of mourning, its grand halls now filled with whispers and stolen glances. Lukas, devastated and confused, barely had time to process his father's passing before the accusations began. The authorities arrived swiftly, armed with evidence that painted him as the prime suspect. His fingerprints were found on a teacup in the study. His shoes bore traces of mud from the garden outside, and a torn piece of his shirt was discovered near the doorway. The weight of it all left him speechless. He tried to explain that he had not been in his father's study that night, that he had no reason to harm him, but the officers were unmoved. The world around him blurred as he was handcuffed and led out of the house, his brothers standing motionless at the doorway, their faces a mask of sorrow. He searched their eyes for some sign of support, for any indication that they would fight for him, but all he found was silence. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with judgment. Journalists jotted down notes, flashing cameras, capturing every moment of Lukas's downfall. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case, laying out the evidence with precision. Witnesses were called, housemaids who had heard arguments between Lukas and his father, a security guard who claimed to have seen Lukas lingering near the study door. Every detail, every shred of suspicion, was twisted into something damning. When Tade and Bayo took the stand, they played their roles to perfection. Tade, the elder brother, spoke with a voice heavy with grief, detailing how Lukas had become distant in recent months, how he had felt overlooked and unappreciated. "He loved our father, but he also resented him," Tade said, shaking his head as if struggling with the weight of the truth. Bayo, wiping away a tear, recounted an alleged conversation where Lukas had spoken bitterly about never being given enough responsibility. The courtroom absorbed their words, the jury nodding solemnly. Lukas wanted to scream, to tell them it was all a lie, but he was drowning in a sea of carefully constructed deception. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Lucas's hope dimmed. His defense lawyer fought hard, challenging inconsistencies in the testimonies, questioning the motives of the witnesses, but the damage had already been done. The jury had made up their minds. When the verdict was read, guilty, Lucas felt the world collapse beneath him. His mother let out a wail that echoed through the courtroom, but the judge's voice remained firm as he delivered the sentence: life imprisonment. The weight of those words settled over Lucas like a crushing force, yet it was not the punishment itself that shattered him. It was the betrayal. As he was led away in shackles, he turned one last time to look at his brothers. Tate's face was unreadable, but Bale refused to meet his gaze, and in that moment, Lucas knew the truth. They had won. They had taken everything from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Prison was nothing like the world Lucas had known. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and despair, the walls damp with years of neglect. The once promising young man, who had dreamed of building his father's empire, now found himself confined to a cramped cell, stripped of his freedom and dignity. He spent his days in silence, replaying every moment that led to his downfall, searching for the mistake he had made, some sign, some warning he had failed to notice. The truth was unbearable. His own blood had orchestrated his ruin, and the world had believed him. The betrayal cut deeper than the harshest of prison punishments. He was surrounded by men who had accepted their fate, but Lucas was different. He was innocent, and yet no amount of truth could change the iron bars that caged him. The days blurred into weeks, each one a painful reminder that his father's murder had stolen not only his freedom but his future. He kept to himself, unwilling to engage with the hardened criminals who had long since abandoned hope. Survival in prison required adaptation, but Lucas could not bring himself to adjust. He was a man buried alive, suffocating under the weight of injustice. Months passed, and the darkness within him grew. There was no one left to fight for him. His stepmother had tried, but her influence was weak against the force of public perception. The business he had once dreamed of running now lay in the hands of his brothers who visited him only once, not to gloat, but to ensure he understood there was no escape. Tate had spoken calmly, his voice measured and firm. "It's over, Lucas. The sooner you accept it, the better." Bale had not spoken at all, only offering a single glance before turning away. That was the last time Lucas saw them. Their absence was more painful than their presence. Even if he wanted revenge, he had no power to achieve it. He was just another forgotten prisoner, lost in a system that had no room for the truth. As the second year of his imprisonment approached, his mind dulled. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this, and he had learned to live without it. It was on an evening like any other that the shift in fate began, so subtle at first that Lucas barely noticed it. A new prison head had arrived, an older man with a strong presence and sharp eyes. He carried himself differently than the others, moving with an air of quiet authority that made the guards stand straighter when he passed. Lucas paid him no mind, until one day the man called his name. "Lucas Atacunal," he said, looking at him as if he had known him all his life. Something about the way he spoke sent a shiver through Lucas. There was recognition in his gaze, familiarity that Lucas could not place. "Your father was a great man," the prison head continued, his tone laced with something unreadable. "I knew him well." Lucas remained silent, unsure of where this was going, afraid to hope. But then the man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough for only Lucas to hear. "I don't believe you killed him." The words sent a jolt through Lucas's chest. It was the first time since his arrest that anyone had dared to question the story his brothers had spun. And for the first time in 2 years, something stirred inside him, a flicker of something he had long thought dead. Lucas sat in his cell long after the prison head had walked away, his mind unraveling the weight of those few simple words. "I don't believe you killed him." It had been 2 years since anyone had questioned the verdict, 2 years since anyone had looked at him and seen more than a convicted murderer. He had spent so long buried under the weight of injustice that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone listen, really listen. The prison head, Mr. O'Cone, was no ordinary officer. There was something about his gaze, the way he had spoken about Chief Adekunle, that made Lukas uneasy. Was this a test? A trick designed to make him lower his guard? But as the hours passed, Lukas realized that for the first time since his arrest, he had nothing to lose. If this man truly believed him, then perhaps, just perhaps, he had a chance. A fragile hope, weak and unfamiliar, took root inside him, but he knew better than to cling to it too soon. Hope had a way of disappointing those who trusted it too quickly. The next few days were strange. Mr. O'Cone didn't call for Lukas again, nor did he acknowledge him in passing. It was almost as if their conversation had never happened. Lukas tried to push it from his mind, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Had the prison head simply been speaking out of pity? Or had he been waiting for something, watching for something? Then, on a quiet afternoon, one of the guards appeared at his cell. "You have a visitor," the man muttered, his tone laced with boredom. Lukas frowned. No one had visited him in over a year. He followed the guard down the dimly lit hallway, his heart pounding against his ribs. When they reached the visitor's room, his breath caught in his throat. A woman stood on the other side of the glass, her expression unreadable. He recognized her immediately, Adeora, Tade's ex-girlfriend. Of all the people in the world, she was the last person he had expected to see. She hesitated only for a moment before picking up the receiver. "I know you didn't do it," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around the phone. Lukas blinked, convinced he had misheard her, but her next words sent a chill through him. "I think I can prove it." The conversation that followed was quick, hushed, and heavy with tension. Adeora revealed that, years ago, when she had still been with Tade, she had come across something unusual, an intercepted message, a conversation between Tade and the former prison head. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was just business. But recently, after hearing about the change in prison management, the memory had resurfaced. The message had been cryptic, but it had suggested something sinister. Make sure he rots there. No mistakes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her start digging. With Mr. O'Cone's arrival, she had finally gathered the courage to come forward. Lukas sat frozen, unable to process the sheer weight of what she was saying. After all this time, was this the crack in the wall he had been waiting for? Adeora's voice softened, but there was a steel-like resolve beneath her words. "If you want to fight this," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "I'll help you." And for the first time in 2 years, Lukas let himself believe. Lukas lay awake that night, his mind tangled in a web of possibilities. Adeora's words echoed in his head, stirring something he had not felt in a long time, determination. For 2 years he had lived in silence, caged by lies, but now, for the first time, there was a chance to fight back. He thought about Tade, about the smooth way he had stood in court and painted Lukas as the villain. He thought about Bayo, the younger of the two, who had never spoken much but had let his silence betray him. They had stolen his life, and for what? Greed? Fear? Or simply because they could? Lukas clenched his fists as a slow, simmering anger spread through his chest. He had been too stunned, too broken to fight when they first turned on him, but now he had something he hadn't before, a sliver of proof. If Adeora's memory was correct, if there truly was a hidden conversation between Tade and the former prison head, then that meant they had planted him here. It meant that everything he had suffered was by design. The next morning, Lukas was summoned to the warden's office. He walked into the small, dimly lit room to find Mr. O'Cone waiting for him, his expression unreadable. "Sit," the man said, his deep voice carrying an air of authority that demanded obedience. Lukas obeyed, his pulse quickening. Mr. O'Cone leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I spoke to Adeora," he began, his gaze sharp. Lukas didn't move, didn't breathe. She told me about the intercepted message. The warden's fingers tapped lightly against the table. It's not enough to overturn a conviction, but it's enough to raise suspicion. A beat of silence passed between them before Mr. O'Cone exhaled. I knew your father well, he admitted. He was an honorable man, and something about your case never sat right with me. Lukas swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. What happens now? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Mr. O'Cone steadied him for a moment before answering. We reopen the case, he said simply, and this time we dig deeper. Lukas had thought nothing could shake him anymore, but hearing those words sent a tremor through his body. Reopening the case meant dragging everything back into the light. It meant exposing the cracks in his brother's carefully built lies, and it meant facing them again. But there was no room for fear. Too much had been stolen from him already. That night, as he returned to his cell, he allowed himself to imagine it, the moment he would stand in court not as the accused, but as the one revealing the truth. He envisioned Tade's face when the weight of his deception came crashing down. He pictured Bayo's silence breaking under pressure. For the first time in years, the thought of justice felt within reach. And though he knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, Lukas was ready to walk it. The war had begun. The first step in reopening the case was gathering evidence, something that seemed nearly impossible at first. The years had buried most of the details, and whatever had once been in Lukas's favor had been erased or twisted beyond recognition. But Mr. O'Cone was not a man who backed down easily. He had seen enough corruption in his years to know when something smelled rotten, and the more he looked into Lukas's conviction, the clearer it became that things had been orchestrated against him. Records from the original investigation were filled with inconsistencies, witnesses who had suddenly changed their statements, forensic reports that lacked crucial details, and, most suspiciously, the rapid way in which Lukas had been convicted despite the lack of direct evidence. None of it made sense, at least not until Adara brought forward the intercepted conversation. That was the first real break, the first undeniable proof that Tade had pulled strings to ensure Lukas never saw the outside of a prison cell again. But proving that was another battle entirely. A message alone would not be enough. They needed something irrefutable. Adora, determined to correct the wrongs of the past, took it upon herself to search for anything that had been overlooked. She started with the courthouse, using her connections to quietly sift through old records. That was when she found it, the bubble gum. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another item logged into evidence from the crime scene. But Adora remembered something about Tade, a habit he had since they were together. He always chewed gum, always carried a pack in his pocket. The thought made her pulse quicken. If the gum had been at the scene, could it have belonged to him? She dug deeper, looking into whether forensic testing had ever been conducted. To her frustration, she discovered that while the gum had been collected, it had never been analyzed. Technology at the time had its limits, and without a direct reason to examine it, the item had been left to gather dust. But times had changed, and science had advanced. If they could get that gum tested now, they might finally have the proof they needed. Getting approval for a new forensic test was not easy, but Mr. O'Cone had connections of his own. With his influence, the request was pushed through, and within days, the analysis began. Lukas, confined to his cell, waited in silence, each passing moment stretching into eternity. If the gum carried Tade's DNA, it would be the first undeniable link between him and the crime scene. If it didn't, Lukas would remain exactly where he was, forgotten by the world. Days turned into a week, and then, at last, the results came in. The DNA was a match, Tade's. The revelation sent a shockwave through everyone involved. There was no explanation, no way for Tade to dismiss his presence at the crime scene. It was the break they had been waiting for, the moment everything changed. Lukas, who had spent 2 years drowning in hopelessness, now had something he never thought he would find again, a weapon against the lies that had buried him. And this time, he was ready to fight. The moment the DNA results confirmed Tate's presence at the crime scene, the tides of the case shifted. Mr. Ocone wasted no time in escalating the findings, ensuring that the new evidence reached the right hands before it could be buried under another layer of corruption. Adaora, who had once been hesitant about stepping forward, became relentless. She worked alongside the lawyer Mr. Ocone had arranged, determined to piece together every missing link. Lukas, still confined behind prison walls, could do nothing but wait. The days crawled by, each one filled with the unbearable weight of uncertainty. Would this be enough? Would the truth finally force its way through the cracks, or would his brothers find a way to twist things once again? He had learned long ago that justice was not guaranteed, that sometimes the guilty walked free while the innocent suffered. But this time felt different. This time, there was something solid, something his brothers could not explain away with clever words and well-placed lies. As the case was reopened, the weight of the past began to suffocate Tate and Bale. At first, they remained defiant, refusing to acknowledge the evidence stacking against them. But the investigation was no longer under their control. The court demanded explanations, and the carefully woven narrative they had built over the years began to unravel. Prosecutors dug into their financial records, exposing the reckless spending that had drained their father's wealth. Witnesses who had once been silent started speaking, some out of guilt, others out of fear of being implicated in the cover-up. Lucas's lawyer pressed harder, revealing discrepancies in the original trial that pointed to tampering. And then the final blow came. A former prison official, one of the men who had worked closely with the previous warden, stepped forward. Whether out of regret or a desire to save himself, he admitted to receiving orders to ensure Lukas never saw freedom. The truth was no longer just a theory. It was a storm sweeping through every lie that had been told. When Lukas was finally called to testify, he walked into the courtroom with a quiet determination. He was not the same man who had stood there 2 years ago, drowning in helplessness. He had spent too much time being silenced, too much time accepting a fate that was never his to bear. As he took his place before the court, his eyes met Tate's for the first time in years. There was no arrogance in his brother's gaze now, no smirk of victory, only the weight of a man realizing that the walls he had built around his crime were finally closing in. Lukas spoke, his words measured and precise, recounting the life he had before his father's murder and the torment that followed after. He did not beg for sympathy, nor did he ask for vengeance. He simply told the truth. And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place where his brothers dictated the story. It was where they would finally face the consequences of their betrayal. The courtroom was silent as the weight of Lucas's words settled over those present. Each syllable peeled away the deception his brothers had carefully laid, revealing the raw truth beneath. He spoke of his father's love, of the resentment that had festered in Tate and Bale like a disease. He recounted the years he spent in his father's shadow, not as a competitor for wealth, but as a son who simply wanted to build something meaningful. He described the night of the murder, not from his own memory, but from the wounds it left on his life. How he was taken, shackled, and condemned before he even had a chance to understand what was happening. The prosecution followed his testimony with the irrefutable proof they had gathered. The bubble gum with Tate's DNA, the intercepted messages, the financial records that showed how desperate they had been to erase Lukas from the picture. Witness after witness came forward, filling in the gaps that had once made their crime untouchable. The air was thick with tension as all eyes turned to the brothers who had built their lives on deceit. Tate, once the confident and charismatic elder brother, now sat rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as though he could stop the inevitable. Bale, usually quiet and calculated, had lost the composure he once carried so effortlessly. The evidence was undeniable, and the whispers in the courtroom grew louder. When the judge demanded an explanation, Tate did what he had always done. He tried to control the narrative. He claimed he had only been at the scene by accident, that the evidence was circumstantial, that Lukas had been manipulating everyone all along, but his voice wavered, the certainty cracking with every denial. Then came the moment no one expected. Baal, after years of living under his elder brother's shadow, finally broke. Whether it was fear, guilt, or the crushing realization that the truth could no longer be buried, he spoke. He admitted to everything, not just the murder, but the planning, the cover-up, the relentless push to keep Lukas imprisoned. His confession was not a dramatic outburst, not a desperate attempt to save himself. It was quiet, shaking, filled with the regret of a man who had spent too long running from his own conscience. The courtroom erupted. Lawyers scrambled. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, and Lukas sat frozen, absorbing the reality of it all. He had imagined justice for so long, but now that it was unfolding before him, it felt surreal. Tate turned on Baal in an instant, his anger spilling out in hushed threats, but it was over. The judge called for order, and the verdict that had once seemed impossible was now clear. Lukas was no longer the convicted criminal, no longer the black sheep painted as a monster. He was the wronged son, the victim of a crime more wicked than anyone had imagined. And Tate and Baal, they were no longer his brothers. They were murderers awaiting their own sentence. As the proceedings came to an end, Lukas allowed himself a deep, steady breath. He was not free just yet, but the shackles of injustice had finally begun to crumble. Lukas stepped out of the courthouse into the fading sunlight, feeling the weight of 2 long years finally lift from his shoulders. The air outside felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. The boy who had been dragged away in chains was not the same man who now stood with his head high, free at last. Mr. O'Cone placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgment of the battle they had fought together. Adiora stood a few steps away, watching him with quiet relief. She had played her part, helping uncover the truth when no one else could. Yet even as justice had been served, Lukas knew that the scars of betrayal would never truly fade. His brothers, Tate and Baal, had not just stolen his years. They had shattered the foundation of what family was supposed to be. Their sentences were still pending, but it no longer mattered to him. They had already lost the most valuable thing they could have had, freedom, not just in body, but in conscience. Returning home was not as simple as stepping through familiar doors. The house he had once known had become something else, a place filled with echoes of a past he could no longer claim. His father's absence loomed over every wall, every piece of furniture untouched since that fateful night. The business, once a thriving legacy, had been drained of its strength, left in ruins by the very sons who had hoped to control it. Lukas walked through the empty halls, feeling the weight of all that had been lost, but even in the ruin he saw possibility. He had not fought this hard just to reclaim what was taken. He had fought to prove that he was more than their victim. The world had tried to bury him, but he had risen. Now, standing in the remnants of his father's empire, he knew he had a choice. He could abandon the past and start fresh, or he could rebuild, not just the business, but the legacy his father had wanted him to carry forward. In the days that followed, Lukas chose to rebuild, not for revenge, not for validation, but because he refused to let his brother's betrayal define his story. He hired back loyal employees, restructured what remained, and put in the work that Tate and Baal had never been willing to do. Mr. O'Cone remained a guiding hand, offering wisdom when the weight of it all felt too much. Dara, despite everything, stayed in touch, checking in on him as he navigated life beyond prison walls. Though the pain of his brother's actions would never fully heal, Lukas no longer carried the burden of their choices. They had made their decisions, and now they would live with them. As he stood in his father's old office, overlooking the business that had once been on the verge of collapse, he allowed himself a rare smile. The past had tried to break him, but in the end, he had done what they never expected. He survived. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.